On an August morning in 79 AD, the residents of Pompeii awoke to what seemed like an ordinary day in their prosperous Roman city. The morning markets were opening, bakers were preparing bread, tavern keepers were serving breakfast to customers, and wealthy citizens were planning their day's activities. Mount Vesuvius loomed over the city as it always had, its slopes covered with vineyards and farms, a benign presence that had been quiet for centuries. By nightfall, Pompeii would be gone. Buried under meters of volcanic ash and pumice, the city and thousands of its inhabitants would be entombed in a catastrophic eruption that would destroy multiple cities and change the landscape of the Bay of Naples forever. This is the story of Pompeii, not a tale of horror, but an examination of one of history's most famous natural disasters, of the people who lived and died in a Roman city, of the volcano that destroyed them, and of the extraordinary archaeological legacy that preservation under ash has given to the world. Life in Pompeii, before the eruption. Pompeii in 79 AD was a thriving Roman city with a population estimated between 11,000 and 15,000 inhabitants. Located on the Bay of Naples in the Campania region of southern Italy, Pompeii enjoyed a strategic position that contributed to its prosperity. The city was situated near the mouth of the Sarno River, which provided access to inland agricultural regions, and it had proximity to the sea that enabled trade throughout the Mediterranean. The fertile volcanic soil of the surrounding countryside, enriched by previous eruptions of Vesuvius, supported productive agriculture including vineyards, olive groves, and grain fields. The city had a long history predating Roman control. Originally settled by indigenous Italic peoples, Pompeii came under Greek influence in the 6th century BC and later fell under Samnite control before being conquered by Rome in 89 BC during the Social War. By 79 AD, Pompeii had been a Roman city for more than 150 years and had been thoroughly Romanized in its culture, architecture, and administration. The urban layout of Pompeii reflected Roman planning principles, with streets laid out in a grid pattern and the city divided into distinct neighborhoods called regiones. The Forum, located near the southwest corner of the city, served as the civic, commercial, and religious center. Surrounding the Forum were temples dedicated to Jupiter, Apollo, and other deities, the basilica where legal business was conducted, the Macellum or market building, and various administrative offices. Pompeian houses ranged from modest dwellings to elaborate villas that demonstrated the wealth and status of their owners. The homes of the wealthy followed the typical Roman plan of an atrium house, with rooms arranged around a central courtyard that was open to the sky and often featured a pool called an impluvium to collect rainwater. The walls were decorated with frescoes showing mythological scenes, landscapes, architectural illusions, and still lifes. Floors featured intricate mosaics made from small tiles of colored stone and glass. The largest houses included gardens with fountains, sculptures, and carefully cultivated plants. Public amenities in Pompeii included 2 theaters, a large theater that could seat approximately 5,000 spectators, and a smaller covered theater for musical performances and recitations. An amphitheater on the eastern edge of the city, one of the oldest permanent amphitheaters in the Roman world, accommodated approximately 20,000 spectators for gladiatorial games and animal hunts. The city had 3 sets of public baths, where citizens could exercise, bathe, and socialize. An aqueduct brought water from distant sources to supply the baths, public fountains, and the houses of wealthy residents who could afford private water connections. The large theater was built into a natural hillside that provided support for the seating tiers and created excellent acoustics, following Greek architectural principles adapted for Roman theatrical performances, including comedies, tragedies, and pantomimes that were popular entertainment in the 1st century AD. The smaller covered theater, called the Odeon, had a roof that improved acoustics for musical performances and poetry recitations, and its more intimate setting was suitable for cultural events that attracted smaller, more elite audiences than the mass entertainment offered in the larger theater. The amphitheater, built around 70 BC, predated the famous Colosseum in Rome by more than a century, and demonstrated Pompeii's prosperity and its citizens' enthusiasm for gladiatorial combat, which was both popular entertainment and a means for elite patrons to demonstrate their wealth and gain political support by sponsoring games. Graffiti found on walls throughout Pompeii advertised upcoming gladiatorial games, identified famous gladiators by name, and recorded the outcomes of contests, showing the intense public interest in these violent spectacles. The three bath complexes, the Stabian Baths, the Forum Baths, and the Central Baths, each followed the typical Roman pattern of separate sections for men and women, with rooms of different temperatures, including the Frigidarium, cold room, Tepidarium, warm room, and Caldarium, hot room, allowing bathers to move through a sequence of bathing experiences. The baths also included exercise areas called palaestrae, where men could wrestle, box, or engage in other athletic activities before bathing, making the bath complexes important centers of male social life, where business and political matters were discussed alongside leisure activities. The hypocaust system beneath the floors of the bath buildings used furnaces to heat air that circulated under raised floors and through hollow walls, warming the rooms and the water and pools, and demonstrating the sophisticated engineering that Romans applied to creating comfortable environments. The aqueduct that supplied Pompeii was a branch of the Serino Aqueduct, an impressive engineering work that brought water from springs in the mountains more than 25 kilometers away, using only gravity to move water through channels that descended gradually toward the city. The water entered Pompeii at the highest point and flowed to a distribution tower called the Castellum Aquae, where it was divided into three channels, supplying different parts of the city's water system, with priority given to public fountains that provided free water to all citizens. Public fountains were positioned at street corners throughout the city, typically spaced so that no resident had to walk more than 100 meters to access water. And these fountains were built of stone with basins, where people could fill containers or where animals could drink. The provision of free public water was considered a responsibility of the city government and a demonstration of civic virtue by the wealthy citizens who held public office and who sometimes paid for the construction or repair of fountains from their own funds. Private houses of wealthy residents could connect to the water system by paying fees to the city and installing lead pipes that brought water directly into their homes, allowing them to have fountains in their gardens and running water in their kitchens and sometimes in private bathrooms. The availability of abundant water transformed urban life by making bathing accessible to all social classes, supporting public health through sanitation, enabling industries like fulling and dyeing that required large quantities of water, and contributing to the beauty of the city through fountains and water features in public spaces and wealthy homes. Commerce was central to Pompeian life. The city's shops, workshops, and taverns lined the streets, particularly along main thoroughfares. Archaeological excavation has identified bakeries with large mills for grinding grain and ovens for baking bread, fulleries where cloth was cleaned and processed, dye works, metalworking shops, pottery workshops, and numerous taverns and food shops that sold prepared food and drink. Some establishments combined retail sales with manufacturing, with workshops on the ground floor and living quarters above. The economy of Pompeii was based on a combination of agriculture, trade, and manufacturing. Wine production was particularly important, with the volcanic soil producing grapes that made wine highly prized throughout the Roman world. The city also produced olive oil, garum, a fermented fish sauce that was a staple of Roman cuisine, and textile products. Pompeii's location made it a hub for redistributing goods brought by sea from other parts of the Mediterranean. Social life in Pompeii reflected the hierarchies and customs of Roman society. The city was governed by elected magistrates from the elite families who competed for office and demonstrated their wealth through public benefactions, including funding games, building projects, and distributions of food or money to citizens. Below the elite were freedmen, former slaves who had been manumitted, artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers. Slavery was fundamental to the Pompeian economy, with slaves working in households, shops, agriculture, and construction. Religion permeated Pompeian life, with temples, shrines, and altars throughout the city dedicated to the traditional Roman gods and to the cult of the emperor. Household religion was practiced at domestic shrines called Lauraria, where families made offerings to household gods and spirits. Mystery cults, including the worship of Isis and Dionysus, attracted followers who sought more personal religious experiences than traditional Roman religion offered. The Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus dominated the northern end of the Forum, dedicated to the chief god of the Roman state, along with Juno and Minerva, forming the Capitoline triad that was central to official Roman religion and that represented the protection of the Roman state over its cities. The Temple of Apollo, one of the oldest sanctuaries in Pompeii dating back to before Roman control, reflected the Greek cultural influences on the city and housed a cult statue of Apollo, along with altar areas where priests performed sacrifices on behalf of the community. The Temple of Venus, patroness goddess of Pompeii, stood on high ground overlooking the city and the bay, serving as a focal point for civic religion and demonstrating the importance Romans placed on maintaining favorable relations with the deity who protected their city. The imperial cult, which venerated deceased emperors who had been officially deified and which showed loyalty to living emperors, had a temple and priests in Pompeii, reflecting the integration of emperor worship into civic life throughout the Roman Empire. Sacrifices at temples involved the ritual slaughter of animals, including sheep, pigs, and cattle, with priests performing the sacrifice according to precise rituals, while magistrates and citizens observed, and the meat was then distributed to participants or sold, making sacrifices important sources of meat for urban populations. Street corner shrines throughout the city, called compedal shrines, served neighborhood worship and were maintained by local residents who made offerings and celebrated festivals that strengthened community bonds among people living in proximity. The household Lauraria varied from simple painted niches to elaborate built shrines, but all served the same function of providing a sacred space where the paterfamilias, male head of household, led daily prayers and offerings to the lares, protective household spirits, and the genius, the divine essence of the family line. Many Lauraria feature painted images of the lares as young men in dancing poses holding drinking horns, flanking a central figure representing the genius, often depicted as a man in a toga, making an offering, with a serpent below representing the protective spirit of the household's prosperity. Daily religious practice involved burning incense, pouring wine libations, and offering small portions of food to the household gods, rituals that reinforced family structure and hierarchy, while also seeking divine protection for the home and its inhabitants. The mystery cults offered initiates secret knowledge and the promise of better afterlives through participation in rituals and ceremonies that were closed to non-initiates, contrasting with the public and civic nature of traditional Roman religion. The Temple of Isis in Pompeii, rebuilt after the earthquake of 62 AD by a wealthy freedman, demonstrates the appeal of Egyptian religious traditions to Romans who were attracted to Isis's reputation as a compassionate mother goddess and to the elaborate rituals and festivals associated with her worship. The cult of Dionysus, Bacchus, god of wine and ecstatic experience, is evidenced by the famous frescoes in the Villa of the Mysteries showing initiation rituals. Though the exact meaning of these paintings and the nature of Dionysian worship in Pompeii remain subjects of scholarly debate. The presence of multiple religious traditions operating simultaneously, traditional Roman religion, imperial cult, Egyptian deities, Greek gods, and mystery religions, demonstrates the religious pluralism of the Roman world and the Romans' willingness to adopt and adapt religious practices from other cultures. Religious festivals punctuated the Roman calendar, providing opportunities for public celebrations, processions, theatrical performances, and games that combined religious observance with entertainment and reinforced community identity and social hierarchies. In the years before 79 AD, Pompeii had experienced challenges. A significant earthquake in 62 AD had damaged many buildings, and 17 years later, some repairs were still ongoing. The earthquake had been a warning of the volcanic activity beneath Vesuvius, though the residents did not understand the connection between earthquakes and volcanism. Despite the ongoing repairs, life in Pompeii in 79 AD was prosperous and relatively normal. Markets were busy, public buildings functioned, new construction and decoration projects were underway, and the citizens pursued their daily activities with no awareness that catastrophe was imminent. The mountain. Understanding Vesuvius. Mount Vesuvius rises approximately 4,200 feet above the Bay of Naples, dominating the landscape of Campania. In 79 AD, the mountain's appearance was different from today. Before the eruption, Vesuvius was taller and had a single peak, whereas the modern mountain has a distinctive profile, with the cone of Vesuvius rising from within a caldera called Monte Somma that was created by the 79 AD eruption. Vesuvius is a stratovolcano, also called a composite volcano, formed by layers of hardened lava, pumice, and volcanic ash, built up over thousands of years of eruptions. This type of volcano is characterized by steep sides and explosive eruptions caused by the composition of the magma, which is relatively viscous and traps gases until pressure builds to catastrophic levels. The geological setting that created Vesuvius involves the subduction of the African tectonic plate beneath the Eurasian plate. As the African plate descends into the Earth's mantle, rock melts and forms magma that rises toward the surface. When this magma reaches the surface, it erupts as lava, ash, and gases. The Bay of Naples sits in a volcanically active region that includes not only Vesuvius, but also the Campi Flegrei caldera, west of Naples, and other volcanic features. The history of Vesuvius's eruptions extends far back before 79 AD. Geological evidence indicates that major eruptions occurred approximately 3,800 years ago and 1,800 years ago, among others. However, in the Roman period, the mountain had been quiet for so long that people did not recognize it as a volcano. Greek and Roman writers mentioned Vesuvius occasionally, sometimes noting that the mountain's slopes showed evidence of past fires. But there was no collective memory of an eruption and no understanding that the mountain posed a threat. The eruption, approximately 3,800 years ago, known as the Avellino eruption, was even larger than the 79 AD eruption and devastated Bronze Age settlements in the region, burying villages under meters of pumice and ash and forcing the abandonment of the area for decades or centuries. Archaeological excavations have discovered Bronze Age villages buried by the Avellino eruption, providing evidence of a thriving prehistoric culture that was destroyed by volcanic activity, though the lack of written records means that this disaster left no historical memory. The approximately 800 years of dormancy between the last major eruption before 79 AD and the eruption that destroyed Pompeii was long enough for multiple generations to be born, live, and die without experiencing any volcanic activity from Vesuvius, erasing any cultural memory or fear of the mountain. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, described Vesuvius as having a flat summit covered with fertile soil, and noted that the mountain's appearance suggested it had once been on fire, but he wrote this as an observation of past geological activity, rather than as a warning of current danger. Strabo's description indicates that the summit of Vesuvius, before 79 AD, featured a crater that had filled in and become vegetated, creating productive farmland that attracted settlement rather than inspiring caution. The Roman agricultural writer Columella mentioned Vesuvian wine as being of particular quality, and the volcanic soil of the mountain's slopes was prized for growing grapes that produced wines exported throughout the Roman world. encouraging development and population growth in an area that was actually extremely dangerous. The philosopher Seneca, writing about the earthquake of 62 AD that damaged Pompeii and other cities around the Bay of Naples, discussed earthquakes as natural phenomena, but did not connect them to volcanic activity or suggest that Vesuvius might erupt, demonstrating that even educated Romans lacked the geological knowledge to recognize the warning signs. The 62 AD earthquake was almost certainly caused by the movement of magma beneath Vesuvius, as the volcano's plumbing system pressurized in the years leading up to the 79 AD eruption. But without understanding of volcanology, Romans interpreted the earthquake as an isolated event, rather than as part of a larger pattern. Smaller earthquakes continued in the years between 62 and 79 AD, with ancient sources indicating that earth tremors became so common that residents became accustomed to them and ceased to be alarmed, a dangerous normalization of warning signs that is common in volcanic regions where people adapt to living with constant minor seismic activity. The Roman lack of a conceptual framework for understanding volcanoes meant that they had no word for volcano and no systematic knowledge of how volcanic systems work, how eruptions are triggered, or what signs might indicate that an eruption is imminent. The name volcano itself derives from Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and forge. But this mythological understanding attributed volcanic activity to divine action, rather than to natural geological processes that could be studied and potentially predicted. Some ancient writers speculated that mountains like Vesuvius and Mount Etna in Sicily were connected to underground fires or to the forge of Vulcan. But these mythological explanations did not lead to practical understanding of volcanic hazards or to recognition that dormant volcanoes could become active again. The very fertility and prosperity that Vesuvius's volcanic soil created in the region around the Bay of Naples encouraged dense settlement and agricultural development, creating the conditions for catastrophic loss of life when the volcano eventually erupted, a pattern that continues today with millions of people living on the slopes of active volcanoes worldwide. The Roman experience with Vesuvius demonstrates how long periods of dormancy can create false confidence and how the absence of living memory of past eruptions can lead populations to discount or ignore geological evidence of danger. Lessons that remain relevant for modern volcanic risk assessment and disaster planning. The recognition that Vesuvius was indeed a volcano capable of catastrophic eruptions came only through the terrible experience of 79 AD, when the mountain that had seemed benign and productive revealed its true nature in a disaster that killed thousands and destroyed multiple cities in a matter of hours. The summit of Vesuvius before 79 AD was described by ancient writers as featuring a flat plain with fertile soil, possibly a crater that had filled in during centuries of dormancy. The slopes were covered with vineyards and farms that took advantage of the rich volcanic soil. Spartacus and his rebel slaves had hidden on Vesuvius during their uprising in 73 BC, using the mountain's rough terrain as a defensive position. The magma chamber beneath Vesuvius had been filling and pressurizing for centuries, perhaps since the eruption 1,800 years earlier. The magma was rich in dissolved gases including water vapor, carbon dioxide, and sulfur compounds. As magma rises toward the surface, the decreasing pressure allows gases to come out of solution and form bubbles, similar to what happens when a carbonated beverage is opened. In a stratovolcano like Vesuvius, the viscous magma prevents gases from escaping gradually, and pressure builds until the rock above the magma chamber can no longer contain it. The earthquake of 62 AD that damaged Pompeii and other cities around the Bay of Naples was almost certainly related to the movement of magma beneath Vesuvius. Earthquakes continued in the years between 62 and 79 AD, though ancient writers suggest that people became accustomed to them and did not recognize them as warning signs of an impending eruption. The Roman world lacked a scientific understanding of volcanoes and did not know that earthquakes could indicate volcanic activity. In August of 79 AD, or possibly October, as recent archaeological evidence suggests the eruption may have occurred later in the year than traditionally believed. The pressure beneath Vesuvius reached critical levels. The magma chamber, located several kilometers beneath the surface, contained magma that was under enormous pressure from both the weight of the overlying rock and from the gases dissolved in it. When the eruption began, the release of this pressure would drive one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in recorded history. The eruption begins August 24th, 79 AD. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD is traditionally dated to August 24th, though recent archaeological discoveries, including the presence of autumn fruits and the wearing of heavier clothing by victims, suggest the eruption may have occurred in October. For the purposes of this account, we will use the traditional date while acknowledging the ongoing scholarly debate about the precise timing. The eruption began around midday on August 24th with a massive explosion that blew open the top of the mountain. The explosion was caused by the sudden release of pressure as the magma chamber breached the surface, allowing dissolved gases to expand explosively. The force of the explosion shattered the rock at the summit and blasted millions of tons of pulverized rock, pumice, and ash into the atmosphere. The eruption column, a towering plume of volcanic material and gases, rose to an altitude estimated at 33 kilometers, approximately 21 miles, into the stratosphere. The shape of the eruption column resembled a Mediterranean stone pine tree, with a narrow trunk rising vertically before spreading out at altitude in a mushroom or umbrella shape. This characteristic appearance led to such eruptions being called Plinian eruptions, named after Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the Vesuvius eruption and described the column's distinctive shape in letters written years later. The material ejected from Vesuvius during the eruption included pumice, a lightweight volcanic rock filled with gas bubbles that forms when lava with high gas content cools rapidly. The pumice fell as lapilli, pieces ranging from pebble-sized to several centimeters across. The eruption also produced fine ash, consisting of pulverized rock and volcanic glass. The rate of ejection has been estimated at approximately 1.5 million tons per second at the eruption's peak, an almost incomprehensible volume of material being blasted into the sky. The pumice was predominantly white or light gray in color during the early phase of the eruption, reflecting the composition of the magma chamber's upper layers. But as the eruption progressed and deeper magma was tapped, the color of the pumice shifted to darker gray, providing evidence that volcanologists use to reconstruct the sequence and intensity of the eruption. The gas bubbles that give pumice its characteristic lightweight, porous structure were formed by water vapor, carbon dioxide, and sulfur gases that had been dissolved in the molten magma under pressure, and that expanded explosively when the magma reached the surface and pressure was released. Individual pieces of pumice were so light that they could float on water, and some pumice from the eruption was carried by rivers and streams into the Bay of Naples, where it floated on the sea surface and was transported by currents, with pumice rafts from major eruptions sometimes traveling hundreds of kilometers from their source. The accumulation of pumice in Pompeii occurred in distinct layers that can still be distinguished in archaeological excavations, with each layer representing a particular phase of the eruption and providing evidence of changes in wind direction, eruption intensity, and the characteristics of the material being ejected. The depth of pumice accumulation varied across Pompeii depending on local topography and on the pattern of winds, but in most areas, the pumice reached depths of 2 to 3 meters during the approximately 18 hours of sustained pumice fall, burying the ground floors of buildings and making movement through the city increasingly difficult. The weight of the accumulating pumice, estimated at approximately 200 kilograms per square meter when depths reached 3 meters, caused roofs throughout the city to collapse, killing people who had taken shelter indoors and creating debris that further complicated attempts to flee. The fine ash component of the eruption was carried higher into the atmosphere than the heavier pumice, and it was distributed over a much wider area, with ashfall detected hundreds of kilometers from Vesuvius, and with the ash cloud affecting visibility and air quality across the Mediterranean region. The volcanic glass in the ash formed when magma was fragmented into tiny droplets that cooled so rapidly that they solidified in a non-crystalline state, creating sharp-edged particles that were dangerous to breathe and that irritated eyes, skin, and respiratory systems. The total volume of material ejected during the eruption is estimated at approximately 4 cubic kilometers of dense rock equivalent, which expanded to many times that volume when fragmented into pumice and ash, representing the emptying of a substantial portion of the magma chamber that had been pressurizing beneath Vesuvius for centuries. The eruption released an estimated 100,000 times the thermal energy of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, a comparison that helps convey the scale of energy release, but that also highlights the different mechanisms and effects of volcanic versus nuclear explosions. The column of erupting material, ash, and gases created its own weather system, with powerful updrafts, turbulent mixing, and lightning generated by friction between ash particles, creating a spectacular and terrifying display that was visible for hundreds of kilometers. And that was described by Pliny the Younger as resembling a giant pine tree. The sustained nature of the Plinian eruption, lasting approximately 18 hours at high intensity before transitioning to pyroclastic surges, required a continuous supply of magma from depth and a stable configuration of the eruption column, conditions that are relatively rare in volcanic eruptions, and that distinguish Plinian events from other types of volcanic activity. The fallout pattern from the eruption was strongly influenced by prevailing winds from the northwest, which carried the eruption column and its burden of pumice and ash toward the southeast, directly over Pompeii, Stabiae, and other settlements, while cities to the west and north of Vesuvius, including Naples, received much less pumice and were less severely affected. The chemical composition of the erupted material was typical of the magmas generated in subduction zone volcanoes, with high silica content that made the magma viscous and gas-rich, creating the conditions for explosive eruptions, rather than the more gentle, effusive eruptions that characterize volcanoes like those in Hawaii. The eruption column was driven upward by the tremendous heat of the volcanic gases and by the continuous supply of material being ejected from the vent. The height reached by the column was determined by the balance between the upward momentum and buoyancy of the hot gases, and the weight of the solid particles being carried upward. At the top of the column, the material spread out and began to fall back to Earth, carried by winds and distributed across the landscape. From Pompeii, located approximately 9 kilometers, 5.5 miles, southeast of Vesuvius, the eruption column would have been terrifyingly visible. The column rose directly from the mountain, growing taller and spreading wider as pumice began to fall. The prevailing winds were from the northwest, carrying the eruption column and the falling pumice directly toward Pompeii and the cities to the south and east of Vesuvius. The fall of pumice on Pompeii began within an hour of the eruption's start and continued for approximately 18 hours. The pumice accumulated at a rate of several centimeters per hour, and by evening the streets were buried under a meter or more of pumice. The weight of the accumulating material began to cause roofs to collapse, killing people who had taken shelter indoors and making it increasingly difficult to move through the city. During the early hours of the eruption, Pompeii's residents faced crucial decisions about whether to flee or to shelter in place. Some fled immediately, heading south towards Stabiae or west toward the coast in hopes of escaping by sea. Others remained in their homes, either unable to leave due to age or infirmity, unwilling to abandon their property, or believing that the eruption would subside and that sheltering indoors was safer than attempting to flee through falling pumice. The pumice fall, while frightening and damaging, was not immediately lethal to those who protected themselves from falling stones. People who remained indoors or who covered their heads could survive the falling pumice as long as they avoided collapsing buildings. The greater danger would come later. when the character of the eruption changed from a sustained column producing pumice fall to a collapsing column producing pyroclastic flows. Throughout the afternoon and night of August 24th, the eruption continued with unabated intensity. The darkness caused by the ash cloud would have been absolute, with the sun completely blocked and the only light coming from the fires of the eruption and from lightning generated by the friction of ash particles in the eruption column. The noise would have been tremendous. The continuous roar of the eruption, the crash of collapsing buildings, and the impact of falling pumice created a cacophony that prevented communication and added to the terror. Pliny the Younger, who was approximately 18 years old at the time, witnessed the eruption from Misenum, approximately 30 kilometers across the Bay of Naples from Vesuvius. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, was the commander of the Roman fleet stationed at Misenum, and a natural historian who was curious about unusual natural phenomena. When the eruption column was spotted, Pliny the Elder launched ships to observe the phenomenon more closely and to rescue people from the affected areas. The elder Pliny died during this rescue mission, overcome by volcanic gases on the beach at Stabiae. The destruction, pyroclastic surges, and death. On the morning of August 25th, approximately 18 hours after the eruption began, the character of the event changed catastrophically. The eruption column, which had been sustained at high altitude by the upward thrust of gases and heat, became unstable and began to collapse. This collapse produced pyroclastic surges, ground-hugging flows of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments that raced down the slopes of Vesuvius at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. Pyroclastic surges are among the most deadly volcanic phenomena. They consist of a turbulent mixture of volcanic gases at temperatures of 200 to 700 degrees Celsius, fine ash particles, and larger rock fragments, all moving at hurricane speeds. The density of the mixture is greater than air, but less than the ground-hugging pyroclastic flows of dense material, allowing surges to travel over obstacles and to penetrate buildings and other enclosed spaces. The first pyroclastic surge from Vesuvius struck Herculaneum, located on the coast about 7 kilometers west of the volcano, at approximately 1 a.m. on August 25th. Herculaneum had received relatively little pumice fall during the previous day because the winds had carried the eruption column away from the city. Many residents had evacuated during the afternoon and evening of August 24th, but several hundred people had remained, some sheltering in boat chambers, on the beach, in hopes of being rescued by sea. The people waiting on the beach would have been watching the eruption throughout the night, seeing the glow of fire from the volcano and the continuous lightning in the ash cloud, waiting desperately for boats that could carry them to safety across the bay. The closer proximity of Herculaneum to Vesuvius meant that when the eruption column collapsed and pyroclastic surges began, the city was struck earlier and with greater force than Pompeii, giving those who had remained virtually no warning or opportunity to escape once the character of the eruption changed. The decision to remain in Herculaneum rather than evacuate earlier may have seemed reasonable to some residents, who saw that their city was receiving little pumice fall and who believed they could wait safely for sea rescue. But this calculation proved tragically wrong when the pyroclastic surges arrived with lethal speed and intensity. When the pyroclastic surge struck Herculaneum, it killed everyone instantly. The superheated gases caused immediate death through thermal shock and asphyxiation. The surge then deposited a thick layer of volcanic material that buried the city to a depth of up to 20 meters. The rapid burial and the specific chemical composition of the volcanic deposits at Herculaneum created conditions that preserved organic materials including wood, food, and even some papyrus scrolls that would have decomposed in the conditions that prevailed at Pompeii. Pompeii experienced a series of 6 pyroclastic surges during the early morning hours of August 25th. The first surges, which arrived around 6:30 a.m., were relatively dilute and did not reach the city walls with full force, though they would have killed anyone caught in the open outside the city. The later surges were more powerful and more deadly, overtopping the city walls and penetrating throughout the urban area. The people who had survived the night in Pompeii, those who had found shelter from the falling pumice, and whose buildings had not collapsed, now faced a new and more immediate threat. Some may have been attempting to flee the city in the early morning, digging their way through the pumice that blocked streets and doorways. When the pyroclastic surges struck, death was instantaneous for most victims. The mechanism of death in pyroclastic surges involves multiple factors. The extreme heat causes thermal shock, with the respiratory system and brain being particularly vulnerable to exposure to superheated air. Victims also inhale fine ash and toxic gases including carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide, which cause asphyxiation. The impact of the surge, carrying rock fragments at high velocity, can cause physical trauma. For most victims, death occurred within seconds of the surge's arrival. The bodies of victims were buried by the volcanic material and covered by subsequent ash falls and surges. Over time, the soft tissues decomposed, leaving voids in the hardened ash in the exact shape of the bodies at the moment of death. When archaeologists discovered these voids during excavations in the 19th century, they developed a technique of injecting plaster into the voids before excavating them, creating casts that preserve the final moments of the victims in haunting detail. These casts show people in various positions, curled up as if sleeping, crouched with arms protecting their heads, sprawled as if they had been running or clutching loved ones. The casts capture details including facial features, clothing, and even the expressions of some victims. They provide powerful evidence of the human cost of the eruption and have become among the most iconic and moving artifacts from Pompeii. The total death toll from the eruption of Vesuvius is difficult to determine with precision. In Pompeii, approximately 1,150 bodies have been found during excavations, though not all of the city has been excavated, and some excavated areas were cleared in early excavations without proper recording. Estimates of the total death toll in Pompeii range from 2,000 to perhaps 10,000, with a wide range reflecting uncertainty about how many people were in the city at the time of the eruption and how many successfully fled. In Herculaneum, approximately 340 bodies have been found, most of them discovered in the 1980s in the boat chambers on the ancient beach. The relatively low number of bodies suggests that most of Herculaneum's population successfully evacuated before the pyroclastic surges struck. However, the people who remained and who sought shelter on the beach died when the surge arrived. Other cities affected by the eruption included Stabiae, where Pliny the Elder died, and Oplantis, where a large villa has been excavated. The total death toll from the eruption across all affected areas is estimated at between 1,500 and 16,000, with the wide range reflecting the uncertainty about population numbers and evacuation rates. While the death toll was substantial, it is important to note that many people did escape, and the majority of the population of the affected region survived by fleeing during the hours and days before the pyroclastic surges struck. Burial and preservation. After the pyroclastic surges ceased and the eruption ended, Pompeii lay buried under approximately 4 to 6 meters of volcanic material. Herculaneum was buried even more deeply, under up to 20 meters of deposits. The cities effectively vanished from the landscape, with only the tops of some taller buildings remaining visible above the volcanic debris. The burial of Pompeii created unique preservation conditions that would allow the city to survive relatively intact for nearly 2,000 years. The volcanic ash that buried the city was fine-grained and filled in around objects, creating molds of items that would later decompose. The rapid burial meant that there was little time for looting or salvage of valuable materials. The depth of burial protected the ruins from later disturbance by agriculture or construction. Organic materials, including wood, cloth, food, and human bodies, decomposed over time, but the volcanic deposits retained their shape, creating voids that preserved the form of the decomposed materials. This process created the conditions that allowed for the plaster casts of human and animal bodies to be made centuries later. It also preserved the negative spaces of wooden furniture, doors, and other objects that could be reconstructed through careful excavation. The volcanic materials that buried Pompeii included pumice from the initial phase of the eruption and finer ash and larger fragments from the pyroclastic surges. These materials consolidated over time into a relatively stable matrix that encased the ruins. The chemistry of the volcanic deposits was such that in Pompeii, organic materials decomposed, while in Herculaneum, the different composition of the deposits allowed some organic preservation. Buildings in Pompeii were damaged, but not completely destroyed by the eruption. The roofs collapsed under the weight of a pumice, and the pyroclastic surges damaged upper floors and pushed down some walls. However, the ground floors of many buildings remained substantially intact, with walls standing, frescoes in place, and mosaics on floors. The burial protected these remains from weathering, vandalism, and the recycling of building materials that typically occurred at abandoned Roman sites. After the eruption, the site of Pompeii was not immediately forgotten. Roman sources mention the destruction of the cities, and there were attempts to recover valuables by tunneling into the buried ruins. However, these salvage efforts were limited, and over time, the exact location of Pompeii was lost as the landscape changed and as later development covered the area. The ruins lay undisturbed for centuries, gradually disappearing from active memory and becoming the subject of vague traditions about buried cities. It was not until the 16th century that underground remnants of the cities were accidentally encountered during construction projects, and not until the 18th century that systematic exploration and excavation began. Rediscovery and excavation. The rediscovery of Pompeii began accidentally in the late 16th century when workers digging an underground channel to divert the Sarno River encountered ancient ruins and artifacts. These finds were noted but not recognized as the remains of Pompeii, and no systematic exploration resulted. Similar accidental discoveries occurred over the following decades, with wells and foundation excavations occasionally encountering Roman walls and artifacts. The deliberate search for Herculaneum began in 1709 when a peasant digging a well-discovered marble fragments from the ancient theater. This discovery came to the attention of noble collectors, and tunneling into the buried city began, driven by the desire to recover statues, marble panels, and other valuable antiquities. The tunneling at Herculaneum was unsystematic and destructive, but it did recover spectacular artifacts, including bronze sculptures, that are now in the Naples Archaeological Museum. Excavations at Pompeii began in 1748 under the sponsorship of the Bourbon King Charles III of Naples. The early excavations were treasure hunts aimed at recovering artifacts for royal collections, rather than scientific investigations aimed at understanding the ancient city. Workers tunneled into the ruins, removed portable objects, and then often filled in the excavations without recording what had been found or disturbed. The methods of excavation improved gradually over the following decades. By the early 19th century, excavators began to uncover buildings systematically, to record their findings with drawings and descriptions, and to recognize the importance of leaving some finds in situ rather than removing everything to museums. The appointment of Giuseppe Fiorelli as director of excavations in 1863 marked a turning point in the scientific excavation of Pompeii. Fiorelli introduced systematic excavation methods, dividing the city into regions and blocks for recording purposes, numbers that are still used today. He developed the technique of injecting plaster into the voids left by decomposed bodies, creating the haunting casts of victims that have become iconic images of Pompeii. Fiorelli also began to restore excavated buildings and to present Pompeii as an archaeological park, where visitors could walk the ancient streets and enter houses and public buildings. Excavation of Pompeii has continued intermittently from the 18th century to the present, with approximately 2/3 of the city now excavated. The unexcavated third remains buried, protected from the weathering and decay that affects exposed ruins, and serving as a reserve for future excavations, using techniques and technologies that do not yet exist. The excavations have revealed an extraordinary range of evidence about Roman life. Houses preserve their architecture, decoration, and in some cases, their furnishings. Workshops contain the tools and products of ancient crafts. Public buildings show how Romans bathed, attended theater, worshipped their gods, and conducted civic business. Graffiti on walls provides evidence of popular concerns, humor, and daily life that is rarely preserved in the literary sources written by and for the elite. Food has been preserved carbonized by the heat of the pyroclastic surges, providing direct evidence of diet. Bread was found in ovens. Eggs, fish, and other foods were found in houses and shops. Analysis of sewers and cesspits has provided information about diet and health. The casts of garden spaces have allowed reconstruction of ancient gardens, showing which plants were cultivated and how they were arranged. Pompeii has provided unparalleled evidence about technology and engineering. The water supply system, including the aqueduct, distribution towers, and lead pipes, can be studied in detail. Mills for grinding grain, presses for olive oil and wine, ovens, and other equipment demonstrate Roman manufacturing processes. Construction techniques are visible in exposed walls, showing how Romans mixed concrete, laid bricks, and supported roofs. The social history visible at Pompeii includes evidence of wealth disparities, with elaborate villas contrasting with modest apartments. The electoral notices painted on walls show political competition among the elite. Tavern graffiti and casual inscriptions provide evidence of popular culture. The presence of erotic art and the location of brothels demonstrate aspects of Roman sexuality that are less visible in other sources. What Pompeii reveals about Roman life. The preservation of Pompeii has made it an invaluable resource for understanding Roman civilization, particularly the lives of ordinary people who left few written records and whose material culture is rarely preserved at other sites. The city provides evidence across virtually every aspect of daily life in a Roman city of the 1st century AD. Domestic architecture at Pompeii shows the layout and decoration of Roman houses across the social spectrum. The houses of the wealthy featured the atrium plan, with rooms arranged around a central open courtyard, reception rooms for entertaining clients and guests, private family quarters, gardens with fountains and sculptures, and sometimes second-story additions. The walls were decorated with frescoes showing mythological scenes, garden landscapes, architectural illusions, and still lifes. The 4 distinct styles of Roman wall painting are documented at Pompeii, allowing art historians to trace the development of decorative fashion. More modest housing included apartments in multi-story buildings, rooms above shops, and simple houses with limited decoration. These dwellings show how less wealthy Pompeians lived, often in cramped conditions, but still with access to urban amenities, including public water supplies, baths, and entertainment. Commercial activity is extensively documented at Pompeii. Shops line the streets with large doorways that could be shuttered at night and that opened directly onto the street during business hours. Many shops had stone counters set into the doorway, with large pottery vessels sunk into the counter to hold food or drink for sale. The identification of specific trades through equipment, products, and sometimes through inscriptions or paintings has allowed reconstruction of Pompeii's economic life. Bakeries are particularly well documented, with more than 30 identified in the city. They contain mills for grinding grain consisting of 2 pieces of volcanic stone, a conical base, and an hourglass-shaped upper stone that was rotated by donkeys or slaves to grind grain between the stones. The flour was then baked in large ovens, and carbonized loaves have been found that show the shape and size of Roman bread. Fulleries, where cloth was cleaned and processed, preserve evidence of an important Pompeian industry. The fulleries contain large vats, where cloth was trampled in mixtures of water and substances, including human urine, which contains ammonia that helped clean wool. The fuller's process included washing, treating with fuller's earth, and finishing, producing cloth that was then sold or returned to customers. Taverns and food shops were numerous, providing prepared food and drink to customers who lacked cooking facilities at home or who wanted to eat out. Some establishments were simple bars with counters for serving food and drink. Others had dining rooms where customers could sit to eat. The identification of taverns through their layout and equipment, and sometimes through inscriptions indicating the name of the proprietor or advertising particular offerings, has shown how widespread the practice of eating and drinking in commercial establishments was in Roman cities. Evidence of slavery is pervasive at Pompeii, though the slaves themselves are less visible than their owners. Small rooms interpreted as slave quarters are found in many houses. Equipment, including shackles and iron collars, provides direct evidence of the coercive nature of slavery. Inscriptions sometimes name slaves or freedmen, providing limited information about individuals whose lives are otherwise undocumented. The economic importance of slavery to Pompeian prosperity is clear, though reconstructing the experiences of enslaved people requires inference from limited evidence. Religious life at Pompeii included both public religion practiced at temples and shrines throughout the city, and domestic religion practiced at household shrines. The Temple of Jupiter on the north side of the Forum was the principal temple of the city's patron deity. The Temple of Apollo, the Temple of Venus, and the Temple of Isis served worshippers of those deities. Smaller shrines throughout the city allowed neighborhood worship and the propitiation of protective deities. Household religion centered on the lararium, a shrine typically located in the atrium or garden, where the family made daily offerings to the lares, household gods, and to the genius, the protective spirit of the head of household. Many lararia survive, with their decorative painting showing the protective deities, and sometimes depicting the household members making offerings. Social and political life is documented through electoral inscriptions painted on the exterior walls of buildings. These inscriptions, numbering in the thousands, announce candidates for local offices and urge support for particular individuals. The inscriptions sometimes identify the groups supporting candidates, guilds of particular trades, neighborhoods, or even individual supporters. This evidence provides insight into Roman electoral politics and the competition among elite families for office and status. The human experience, victims and survivors. The eruption of Vesuvius killed thousands of people, each with their own story, their own final moments, and their own place in the community that was destroyed. While most victims remain anonymous, the archaeological evidence provides glimpses into who they were and how they died. The plaster casts of victims show people of different ages and social statuses. Some are adults in the prime of life. Others are elderly. Children and infants are represented, sometimes held by adults who tried to protect them. The positions of the bodies suggest different final moments. Some people appear to have died instantly, overcome by the heat and gases before they could react. Others show evidence of attempting to shield themselves or to flee. One famous cast shows a person crouched with their hands covering their face, a gesture of futility against the pyroclastic surge. Another shows a person lying on their side, apparently having collapsed while attempting to move. A particularly moving cast shows an adult and child together, with the adult's arms around the child in a final protective embrace. These casts, while disturbing, are also profoundly human, showing the universal responses to danger and the bonds between people that persisted to the final moments. The distribution of bodies throughout Pompeii shows different survival strategies. Some victims died in houses, having sought shelter from the falling pumice, but unable to escape when the pyroclastic surges struck. Others died in the streets, apparently attempting to flee when the surges arrived. Some died near city gates, almost having escaped, but overcome just short of safety. At Herculaneum, the discovery of hundreds of bodies in the boat chambers on the ancient beach tells a particularly poignant story. These people had fled to the waterfront, hoping to be rescued by boats. They sheltered in the vaulted chambers that had been used to store boats, waiting for rescue that would never come. When the pyroclastic surge arrived in the early morning hours, it killed them instantly. The bodies show evidence of the intense heat, with some skulls fractured by thermal shock that caused fluids in the brain to boil and expand explosively. Among the victims at Herculaneum was a man wearing a military-style belt who carried a bag containing carpentry tools and a substantial sum of money. He may have been a soldier or a civilian fleeing with his most valuable possessions. A woman was found wearing gold jewelry, including a bracelet in the shape of a coiled snake, indicating wealth and status. These personal details humanize the victims and remind us that these were real people with lives, possessions, hopes, and fears. The survivors of the eruption included those who fled before the pyroclastic surges struck, and those who were far enough away to be outside the zone of total destruction. Pliny the Younger survived at Misenum, though his uncle died attempting to rescue people from Stabiae. Some people from Pompeii may have fled south toward Nuceria, or west toward the coast, and then traveled by sea to safety. The experience of these survivors, losing their homes, their possessions, their communities, and often their families, would have been traumatic, though ancient sources provide little information about their fates. The Roman state provided some assistance to survivors, with the Emperor Titus, who had only recently succeeded his father Vespasian, visiting the region and providing funds for relief and reconstruction. However, Pompeii and Herculaneum were not rebuilt. The burial was too deep, the destruction too complete, and the trauma too great. Survivors relocated to other cities, and the buried cities were gradually forgotten. Vesuvius, after 79 AD. Ongoing risk. Mount Vesuvius did not cease being dangerous after 79 AD. The volcano has erupted repeatedly throughout history, with major eruptions documented in 203, 472, 512, 787, 1036, 1631, and most recently in 1944. The eruption of 1631 was particularly destructive, killing approximately 4,000 people and devastating towns on the volcano's slopes. The 1944 eruption occurred during World War II, destroying the villages of San Sebastiano and Massa di Soma, and demonstrating that Vesuvius remains an active and dangerous volcano. Today, approximately 3 million people live in the area around Vesuvius that would be affected by a major eruption. The region is one of the most densely populated volcanic risk zones in the world. The slopes of Vesuvius are heavily developed with towns, villages, and agricultural areas extending far up the mountain. The city of Naples, with a metropolitan population exceeding 3 million, is located only about 9 kilometers from the volcano. Volcanologists monitor Vesuvius continuously using seismometers to detect earthquakes, GPS to measure ground deformation, gas sensors to detect changes in volcanic emissions, and satellite observations. This monitoring provides data on the state of the volcano and could provide warning of an impending eruption. However, predicting volcanic eruptions with precision remains challenging, and the time between the first clear warning signs and an actual eruption could be short. Italian civil protection authorities have developed evacuation plans for the area around Vesuvius, dividing the risk zone into different areas based on the expected intensity of effects from different types of eruptions. The plans call for evacuation of the highest risk zones before an eruption begins. But evacuating several 100,000 people from a densely populated area would be an enormous logistical challenge, requiring significant advance warning and public cooperation. The risk from Vesuvius is complicated by several factors. The volcano has been relatively quiet since 1944, leading to complacency among residents who may not perceive the danger as immediate or real. The economic and social costs of evacuating and potentially abandoning areas around Vesuvius are substantial, creating resistance to policies that would limit development or that would require permanent relocation of populations. The uncertainty in predicting when and how the next eruption will occur makes it difficult to determine when action must be taken. Geological studies of Vesuvius's past eruptions have shown that the volcano is capable of eruptions even larger than the one in 79 AD. The eruption that destroyed Pompeii was a VEI-5 eruption, volcanic explosivity index, a major eruption but not the largest possible. Vesuvius has produced VEI-6 eruptions in its history, and the potential for such an event in the future cannot be ruled out. A major eruption of Vesuvius today would be a catastrophe affecting millions of people and causing economic damage measured in hundreds of billions of euros. The lesson of Pompeii for modern society is that volcanic hazards are real and that proximity to volcanoes carries risks that must be understood and managed. The preservation of Pompeii provides a vivid reminder of what volcanic eruptions can do to cities and populations, and it underscores the importance of monitoring, planning, and preparedness. The challenge is to balance the benefits of living in a fertile and economically productive region with the risks posed by an active volcano. Archaeological legacy and continuing discovery. Pompeii continues to yield new discoveries more than 270 years after excavations began. Recent excavations have uncovered new houses, shops, and public buildings that add to understanding of the city. Advanced technologies, including ground-penetrating radar, three-dimensional scanning, and digital documentation, are allowing archaeologists to study the site in new ways and to preserve information about excavations for future researchers. One area of recent focus has been the conservation of previously excavated buildings. The ruins that have been exposed to weathering for decades or centuries are deteriorating, and extensive conservation work is necessary to stabilize walls, protect frescoes, and prevent collapse. This work requires careful planning and significant resources, and it demonstrates that excavation creates responsibilities for long-term preservation. New excavation techniques are being applied to learn more from the site, while causing less damage than earlier methods. Rather than large-scale clearance of entire areas, modern excavations often focus on specific questions and use careful stratigraphic methods to document the sequence of deposits. Organic residues are analyzed to identify food remains, human activity, and environmental conditions. DNA analysis of human remains provides information about population origins, relationships, and health. Digital technologies are transforming how Pompeii is documented and presented. Three-dimensional scans of buildings and artifacts create permanent digital records that can be used for research, education, and virtual tourism. Digital reconstruction of buildings as they appeared before the eruption helps visitors understand what they are seeing and allows researchers to test hypotheses about architecture and decoration. Online databases make information about Pompeii accessible to scholars and the public worldwide. The study of Pompeii continues to raise new questions and to refine understanding of Roman civilization. Recent research has focused on topics including water supply and sanitation, the organization of commercial activities, the role of freedmen in the economy, the lives of women and children, and the environmental history of the region. Each new study adds nuance to understanding of how Romans lived and how Pompeii functioned as a city. Pompeii also serves as a case study in archaeological ethics and heritage management. Questions about what should be excavated and what should be left buried, how to balance tourism with preservation, how to present difficult aspects of history, including slavery and social inequality, and how to ensure that local communities benefit from heritage, tourism are all relevant to Pompeii and to archaeological sites worldwide. Conclusion. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD destroyed Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other cities, killing thousands of people and burying urban landscapes under meters of volcanic material. The catastrophe was a human tragedy of significant scale, ending lives, destroying communities, and creating suffering for the survivors who lost homes, families, and their familiar world. Yet the same eruption that destroyed Pompeii also preserved it. The rapid burial under volcanic ash created conditions that protected the city from the decay, looting, and recycling that consumed most ancient Roman cities. When Pompeii was rediscovered in the 18th century and systematically excavated over subsequent centuries, it provided an unparalleled window into Roman life, showing not just monuments and public buildings, but the homes, shops, streets, and objects of daily life that allow us to understand how ordinary Romans lived. The people of Pompeii in 79 AD could not have imagined that their city would become one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, or that their possessions, houses, and even their bodies would be studied by scholars nearly 2,000 years later. They were living normal lives in a prosperous Roman city when catastrophe struck without warning and without mercy. If this examination of Pompeii has provided understanding of what happened during the eruption, how the city was destroyed and preserved, what the archaeological evidence reveals about Roman life, and what lessons the disaster holds for modern societies living near active volcanoes, then it has served its purpose. Pompeii stands as a testament to both the destructive power of nature and the resilience of human achievement. The volcano destroyed the city in a day, but the city has survived in a different form for millennia, teaching us about the past and reminding us of our vulnerability to natural forces. The ruins of Pompeii connect us across the centuries to people who lived, worked, loved, and died in a Roman city, making history tangible and human in ways that few other sites can match. The ongoing risk from Vesuvius reminds us that the story of Pompeii is not merely ancient history, but a warning relevant to the present. Millions of people live in the shadow of an active volcano that has erupted repeatedly and that will erupt again. The challenge for modern society is to learn from the past, to respect the power of nature, to monitor volcanic activity, to plan for disaster, and to protect populations while recognizing that absolute safety near active volcanoes is impossible. The memory of Pompeii, preserved in the ruins, in the casts of victims, in the artifacts displayed in museums, and in the continuing excavations that reveal new evidence, ensures that the people who died on that day in 79 AD are not forgotten. Their city lives on, not as it was, but as a remarkable archaeological site that draws millions of visitors annually, and that continues to contribute to human knowledge about the past. That is the complex legacy of Pompeii, a tragedy that became a treasure, destruction that created preservation, and death that paradoxically gave a kind of immortality to a Roman city and its people.